Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I very much appreciate your kind words, although they make my task somewhat more difficult, as the danger of my disappointing the audience is correspondingly increased. But I'll try not to. And thank you very much for doing me the honor of inviting me to address this distinguished gathering. My topic today, as you've been told, is Iran, a country with which we are all very much concerned nowadays, and about which, as with most of the rest of the Middle East, there is an incredible amount of misunderstanding and misinformation in circulation. Let me begin by making a few general points about Iran. The first point I would like to make is that in contrast with most of the other states that now constitute the region which we call the Near and Middle East, Iran is a real nation or country in the sense in which we use those words in the Western world. Its loyalty is not nationalism as elsewhere in the region, but patriotism, a rather different thing. There is a shared identity. There is great ethnic diversity in Iran. If you go around Iran, you will find all sorts of different ethnic groups speaking different languages. There are Turkish-speaking regions and Arabic-speaking regions and Baluchi-speaking regions and so on. Nevertheless, there is, as I said, a very strong sense of common identity, of Iranian national identity. One example of that, marking the difference between Iran and other countries in the region, is the question of language. After the great Arab conquests of the 7th century, when the Arabs with their new religion of Islam came out of the Arabian Peninsula and advanced westwards across North Africa into Europe, eastwards across Iran into Central Asia and India and beyond. In almost all those countries, the previous language disappeared and was forgotten, and Arabic was adopted. From Iraq all the way across to Morocco, Arabic replaced the previous languages. Some of them survived, two in particular, Kurdish in Southwest Asia, Berber in North Africa. But neither Kurdish nor Berber ever produced, shall we say, a commonly accepted standard language in the sense in which we use that term in speaking of such languages as Arabic or Persian or Turkish. They survived as unrecognized local dialects, though that may be beginning to change now. Of all the countries that were conquered by the Arabs, Iran and Iran alone retained its language. True, that language was greatly changed. It was now written in the Arabic script and included a large vocabulary of Arabic words, just as English after the Norman conquest includes a large vocabulary of French words, but it remains basically Anglo-Saxon. England is not a French-speaking country. And one may say the same of Iran. The Iranian language survived. It was written in the Arabic script. As I said, it had a large borrowing of Arabic terms, but it remained Persian, distinct and different, an Indo-European language. And what I think is particularly interesting nowadays, that in some of the pronouncements which are being circulated by opposition groups in Iran, I've seen a number of their declarations and statements. The percentage of Arabic words is minimal, much less than is normal in written and spoken Persian at the present time. A word or two about the place of Iran in history. There are a number of quite distinctive contributions which I think are worth mentioning. For example, the Arab historians at the time of the conquest tell us that the Persians introduced a new device into warfare, the stirrup, which made cavalry possible. Evidence of stirrups being used further east, but the Persians were certainly the ones who brought them into the Middle East and from the Middle East into Europe. This had two effects, transforming warfare. It also made possible another distinctive Iranian contribution to human civilization. That is what one might call the postal system. the courier relay system. Iran was the first country anywhere to set up a system of courier relays, posts at intervals all over the imperial realm, where couriers could change horses and continue their mission. This was something new and immensely significant in the history of humanity. It is said that they also invented mills. Certainly the earliest evidence we have of both windmills and water mills are from Iran. And that is important too, as the first device for generating energy other than human and animal sweat. We can thank them, of course, for such things as carpets and for well-known games like chess and backgammon. That provides, by the way, an interesting opportunity for a medieval philosopher to explain the fatalistic aspect of Islam. The Quran says, "Nothing shall befall us save what God has written down for us." But the philosophers modify that. They say, life is not a game of chess where you are free to choose your moves all the time. It's rather a game of backgammon. Destiny determines the throw of the dice, but it still leaves you enough freedom to win or to lose the game. That is an interesting modification of the general fatalism of Islamic philosophy. There are, of course, the distinctive Persian foods like sugar and candy and such like. Sugar and candy are both Persian words. Sugar was unknown in the Greco-Roman world. The peach, of course, is from the Latin persicum, which simply means the Persian fruit. After these introductory remarks, let me turn now to our major concern at the present time. That is the revolution. The word revolution is very much used in the modern Middle East. It is indeed the only generally accepted title to legitimacy. Every regime calls itself revolutionary, though most of the processes by which these regimes came to power would be more accurately described by such terms as coup d'etat in French, or putsch in German, or pronunciamiento in Spanish. The history of the English-speaking peoples happily provides no equivalent. This one is a real revolution, make no mistake about it. It is a major event, a major transformation. It is a revolution in the sense in which we speak of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And it's interesting to compare the Iranian Revolution with both of those. We see, for example, a similar impact on the whole area with which they share a common universe of discourse. Both the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution had an enormous impact over the regions which used to be called Christendom. In the same way, the Iranian Revolution had an enormous impact over the whole world of Islam. I remember it so happened not long after the Persian Revolution, I was visiting in Indonesia when I was invited to do a tour of Islamic religious universities. And I found pictures of Khomeini displayed on the walls in the students' quarters. One found similar responses as far west as Morocco, as far south as Black Africa. The impact on the whole world of Islam was very significant. And it has continued, though with changes. Like the French Revolution, like the Russian Revolution, we see, first of all, divisions within the revolution. There are Jacobins and Girondins, there are Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. We see similar internal conflicts within the Iranian Revolution, and this has been going on all the time. We can also, I think, distinguish certain phases in the history of the revolution. And again, there are certain similarities between both the French and the Russian revolutions, the phases of intervention, of terror, of repression, and so on. The Iranian Revolution, I think, has now entered into what one might call the Napoleonic or the Stalin phase. I think the Iranians would prefer to call it Napoleonic. I would prefer to call it Stalin. Now, they are determined to vanquish what they see as the enemy. Now, in any kind of conflict, it is quite useful, if not indeed necessary, to identify and define the enemy. In this country, there seems to be some difficulty in doing this, because it's impolite and politically incorrect to be too specific in identifying enemies. So I won't go into that, and just confine myself to seeing how they define the enemy. Well, there are several levels of definition. One of them is what you might call the internal Islamic one. Iran is predominantly and dominantly Shiite, and there is the old cleavage within Islam between the Sunnis and the Shia. I don't want to go into details on that. Merely let me say this. It's often been said that the difference between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims is like that between the Protestants and Catholics in Christianity. To which I would say, well then, which are the Protestants and which are the Catholics? And the question is unanswerable because it's meaningless. There's absolutely no resemblance at all. The issues are quite different altogether, but I don't propose to go into that now. This conflict, ongoing conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, is an important part of the present situation. Iran is dominantly and predominantly Shiite, and they see their mission as to establish Shiite dominance within Islam. This immediately raises questions in a number of countries where there are Shiite populations subject to Sunni domination. The first, which I would have included in that until not so long ago, is Iraq. Iraq is a country where the population, as far as we know, has in majority been Shiite as far back as we can trace the history. But all that time it has been under Sunni domination. From medieval times through the Caliphate, through the Ottomans, through the British rule, through the monarchy. I would have to describe it accurately. I think I would have to borrow a word from Irish history and call it a Sunni ascendancy. Now that has changed. And the Shia at last, the Shia majority at last, are apparently taking over in Iraq. But that raises interesting questions. When the Iraqi Shia were dominated by the Sunnis, they tended to look to the Iranians as their natural supporters and friends. So there is shall we say, a conflict of interests and perceptions within the Iraqis on this. More important at the present time, and also clearer, are the very large and significant Shia minorities, sometimes even local majorities, in other countries of the region, in all the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, all the way around the Gulf and southwards. These are countries dominated by Sunni regimes, but containing important, sometimes locally, majority Shia populations. These are now very much, shall we say, of interest to the Iranians and their revolution, and are a subject of great concern to the Sunni regimes that dominate those countries. Then, of course, there's the regional aspect. Iran, the present rulers of Iran, are aiming at regional domination. That is, of course, phase one. And who is their regional rival, their regional enemy? Well, for the moment, they seem to see Israel as the main alternative. And hostility and their intentions have been made clear in their various pronouncements on the subject. But we have to remember that that is only phase one of the struggle, or rather phase two. Phase one is at home. Phase two is in the region. Phase three is the global final one. The final struggle, or rather, the final phase of the ongoing struggle, which has continued since the advent of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era, between the two rival religions, Islam and Christianity. Now, as the Muslims see it, and more particularly the radical revolutionary trends among the Muslims, this is the struggle between the true faith and between the true believers and the unbelievers. The unbelievers have gone through various phases. They have been ruled by various regimes and empires In modern times, and we find this in Iranian and also in Al-Qaeda writings, in modern times, the leadership of the world of the infidels was contested in a final phase between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They say, we have defeated and destroyed the one, dealing with the pampered and effeminate Americans will be comparatively easy. And we find that line more particularly in Al-Qaeda and such like groups, but it also seems to inspire Iranian thinking. It's important to bear in mind that this global perception and this terminal historical perception is an important part of their worldview. Every religion, well, I shouldn't say that, but most religions, anyway, those that I know of, have a sort of end-of-time scenario, the time when the Messiah or his equivalent comes or returns, when the final battles take place between the forces of good and the forces of evil, or if you like, between God and the devil. And then after various battles, the forces of good triumph, the evildoers are sent to eternal damnation, and the true believers go to the delights of paradise, which are set forth in specific detail. From Iranian public discourse, there is a widespread belief, shared by many of those in power, that we are now in this final apocalyptic phase of human history. And it's important to bear that in mind, because it means that certain matters which might otherwise serve as a deterrent will not serve as a deterrent. Mutual assured destruction worked as a deterrent in the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, because each knew that the use of nuclear weapons would bring a response in kind and mutual assured destruction. For people with this apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. Something important, I think, to bear in mind. Now, how do we look at it from outside? You will no doubt remember that the initial Western reaction, and more particularly the initial American reaction to the Iranian Revolution, was a very positive one. Particularly in the United States, where the general belief is that any movement to replace a monarchy by a republic must be progressive and therefore good. When the Iranian Revolution was in its early phases, there was considerable reluctance at all levels, government, media, intelligence, and so on, to recognize realities. At the time of the Iranian Revolution, I was back in Princeton. I had been in Iran not long previously, but I was no longer in Iran when the revolution began. I was back in Princeton. And I will confess to you, reading the papers, I read about this man, Khomeini. I had never heard of Khomeini before. But I did what one normally does in my profession. I went to the university library and looked him up in the catalogue to see if there was anything either by him or about him. And there was. There was a little book called Islamic Government by Khomeini. So I checked it out and read it. This book was later described by some observers as Khomeini's Mein Kampf. Not an inaccurate description. It's a really terrifying book in which he sets forth his idea of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic regime which is to be established by it. Obviously, I thought this should be made known. It was extraordinarily difficult to get anyone to listen. I got a couple of Iranian friends. They didn't know the book, but I brought it to their attention, Iranian friends in this country, and they agreed to help me. So we tried the New York Times, tried an article on the Khomeini book. They said, we don't think this would interest our readers. We tried the Washington Post, and they agreed to publish the article. And they did publish an article setting forth the description of Khomeini's book. And immediately, to people from the Washington Post being summoned to various government offices. They were attacked both by the policy people and by the intelligence people, accusing them of allowing themselves to be used by hostile, evil elements seeking to make mischief, to spread these appalling lies about this great and good man and so on. Unfortunately, the book was available only in Persian and Arabic, and there was apparently no one in the intelligence establishment who could read either of these languages. It took a long time. Eventually somebody translated it, and gradually, with some assistance from what was going on in Iran, people were persuaded to accept the reality of the Iranian Revolution. But as I said, it was a long and hard struggle with the media, with the policy people, with the intelligence people. Same with all of them. As I said, it took a long time, but eventually the word spread and it became known. I suppose one might hope that by now we have lost whatever illusions we may have had about the bright progressive future that the Iranian Revolution was bringing to Iran, though some people have substituted a different set of illusions. Let me proceed and end with some quotations which I think are relevant and helpful to understand. Here's one from Khomeini. "A billion Muslims should unite and defeat America." These are his words, translated, of course. This was basically the prime purpose of the Iranian Revolution. That, as he explained, was what it was all about for him and for his followers. That is to say, confronting the ultimate enemy, the great Satan, the leading power of the world of the unbelievers. There was a great Satan and a little Satan, but compared with the great Satan, the little Satan is of relatively minor importance. Another quotation from Khomeini. "The Americans will run away," meaning from the Middle East, "leaving their illegitimate child," meaning Israel, "behind them. And then the Muslims will know what to do." Ahmadinejad, when addressing the Arabs particularly, uses that formula, but has used it many times. And he also makes the point that the Middle East has become the central battleground between the Muslims and the infidels, meaning the West. In other words, since it is now the central ground of the cosmic struggle, it is the Middle East that matters. It is now the battleground between the two global forces, the force of good and the force of evil. Now, what are the possibilities of dealing with this? How does one deal with this threat from Iran? There are two alternatives that are being offered. One of them is the obvious military one. The Iranians are moving probably quite rapidly towards a nuclear weapon. The idea of a nuclear weapon in the hands of people with this apocalyptic mindset is really terrifying. And therefore, the argument is one must do what is necessary to stop it, if necessary, by military attack. It may reach a point when there is indeed no other way to stop it but by military attack. I don't think that we have reached that point yet. I don't think we're even near that point. I think we have to be very careful not to commit one major error. I spoke earlier about the difference between Iran and other countries in the region, that Iran is a real country nation, and its people are inspired by real patriotism, as we use that word in the Western world. It is very important, I think, not to give the Iranian regime the gift of something which they do not at present possess, and that is the loyalty of Iranian patriotism. They have the loyalty of their believers, of course. Now, I should say, Iran must not have nuclear weapons. Try to look at this from the point of view of an Iranian patriot. You will say, what is this? We have a nuclear-armed Russia to the north, a nuclear-armed China to the east, a nuclear-armed India and Pakistan to the south, a nuclear-armed Israel to the west. Who is to tell us that we must not have nuclear arms? One can obviously see what is wrong with the argument, but I think one has to recognize the force of this argument and the way in which many Iranians might respond to this. There are other possibilities for opposing the regime. There are the internal possibilities, the internal openings within Iran, opportunities to help dissident elements, help opposition elements in the country, of which there are many and increasing rapidly. Thanks to the wonders of modern communication, it is now possible to carry on communication with people in Iran, with opposition groups. And one has a fairly good idea of the strength and extent of these opposition groups. We were given a dramatic example of it fairly recently in the response to the rigged elections, that people were willing to risk their lives again and again and again in demonstrations against this utterly ruthless regime. I think is an indication of the strength and determination of the opposition within Iran. And here I would quote one of the slogans that was shouted during the demonstrations by groups of the demonstrators. And they said, unfortunately they said it in Persian, not in English, they said, "America, talk to us, not to them." I think that's a point which deserves, shall we say, more consideration than it has received. Obviously, one has to handle this very carefully, but there are possibilities do exist, and I think that there are examples. For example, a bus strike a little while back in Iran, which caused serious disruption, since most people move around by bus. It seems to me that there is still a lot that one can do by way of helping Iranian opposition groups, aiming, shall we say, at disruption rather than military action. The possibility must be recognized that if all else fails, the military may be the only option that remains. Thank you.